The title of this paper is Killing and Making Alive: The Unintended Theological Consequences of Dave Grossman's Work on Killing. I'm going to present this paper in a little bit of a different way because this is an attempt at the practice of just war in our current setting and time as theologians living in America. I've broken this paper up into 4 sections. I will present each section and then I will call for questions because it's my hope as I go through this that we can work through this together. Because I was arrested when I read this work at the implications that fell out from it. And so I want to be able to work through that. And also, I'm the type of guy who tries to listen intently, and I don't write down every question that comes to mind, but when I think of a question, I fail to ask it because I've moved on to another question because I'm trying to listen, sort of thing. So I've broken this up the way I have, and I'll call for questions after I finish a major section. The matriculation will be my rationale and an introduction to the work. 2 sections on the major portions of the work, and admittedly I can't work through every aspect of the book for you, which is finally why I'll recommend that you pick it up yourselves and read it. And then in my final section I will drop some theological conclusions on all of us to use the language that Michael has already given to me. My interaction with this book began out of pastoral concern. I had a young man, a member of my congregation, come to me and ask my pastoral opinion concerning enlisting into the armed forces. I had interacted in my seminary education and also in my early time in the parish with some of the works already listed from Luther in particular, some of the earlier church fathers. And so I knew from a 16th century perspective what the Lutheran standpoint was on just war. And of course, answering the question, can I serve in the military, was one that I was ready to say yes to. Of course, admittedly, 500 years is a long time for theologians and pastors not to consider the things of just war, especially on the day and culture that they live within. And so I began to study. And I came into contact with the work of Dave Grossman. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, and particularly this book that I hold in my hand titled On Killing. It is not a well-known book, and I understand why. It is because it draws an arresting picture of the tactics used currently by the United States military upon the soul and the conscience of soldiers in order to get them to kill. The intent of Grossman's work is not to present a theological treatise or come to theological conclusions. He is simply, as he states in his subtitle, describing the psychological cost of learning to kill in war and society. This clear rationale and concern from Grossman is not universally accepted. His findings are controversial to many, a matter that he discusses readily in the book. Despite the controversy, though, his conclusions are so clear that it is hard not to take him seriously. Grossman is not an academic pie-in-the-sky analyst, but an actual military combat soldier trained in West Point. He is now a retired Army Ranger and paratrooper, retiring in 1998. He is currently an instructor of military and combat psychology at West Point. He is also the director of the Killology Research Group. As far as this work is concerned, it is currently on the FBI Academy and the DEA Academy's required reading list. It is also on the required reading list of the United States Marine Corps, West Point, and the Air Force NCO Academy. There are several other credentials that I could have listed there about organizations throughout the world that use this book, but that is sufficient. Richard Bernstein, noted New York Times columnist and literary reviewer, commented about this book that it is full of arresting observations and insights. Mr. Grossman's case is too carefully presented, too well-grounded in actual observation, not to be taken seriously. His most incisive passages are those in which he describes the conditions under which the willingness to kill becomes greater. At this time, we'll take a break. Are there any questions about the book itself or the rationale behind why I began reading on this topic?
Does this guy give his personal theological or denominational background at all, or is it purely military overview?
Yeah, it is a totally psychological treatment. It's hard for me to even tell if he has a theological background. The way he talks about, as we'll get into, some of the terms that he will use is completely secular. But his observations, even though he's not out for a theological end, his observations run right to the heart of a theological implication. Any other questions before I move on? Section 2. Historical accounts of non-fires and the reason. Grossman's careful presentation, mentioned by Bernstein above, begins with his analysis of the phenomena of non-fires by American soldiers throughout several American wars. Grossman analyzes the work first of F.A. Lord, the author of the Civil War Collector's Encyclopedia, and we should not be deterred that F.A. Lord was writing a Civil War Collector's Encyclopedia because men are often more concerned about the details of warfare in order to make money than they are about accounting for historical truth. Lord tells us that after the Battle of Gettysburg, a very famous battle in the history of America, 25,574 muskets were recovered from the battlefield at Gettysburg. Astonishingly, 90% of these weapons, a little bit over 24,000, were loaded. 12,000 of those 24,000 were loaded more than once. 6,000 of those multiply loaded muskets were loaded 3 to 10 times. And one weapon was loaded 23 times without being fired. This leads Grossman, as well as other historians, to ask similar questions. Why in a battle like Gettysburg, which is often romanticized for its violence and bloodshed, were there so many unfired muskets left on the ground? Grossman points out, which is important to my point, that these results of the Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg run contrary to the training employed by the military of the North and the South and of many other nations during that time. Grossman points out in Civil War days, and many of us are aware of this, in Civil War days and in many times prior, leading back to the days of Greece and Rome, the military was not trained in any particular way other than by drilling. A mass of men grouped together, trained to do a thing over and over again until they could do it without thinking. In particular, during the Civil War, the primary drill was to load a weapon, fire a weapon, retreat so that another group could advance and reload while you were back, and then come back forward again to fire. This is all rooted in the old Greek and Roman phalanx. Again, Grossman observes, though, with the amount of mind-numbing and endless drilling that went into training a Civil War soldier, 90% of muskets left on the ground without a fired round in them does not make any sense. The idea of a double-loaded musket is completely absurd, and the fact that 6,000 out of 24,000 abandoned weapons on the battlefield of Gettysburg were loaded 3 times to 10 times is completely impossible to fathom. This leads Grossman to conclude that many of the men were simply not firing their muskets as they had been drilled to do. Grossman then interacts with the work of Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, a military historian who observed and chronicled World War II combat and the Korean War. Marshall's observations in his work Men Against Fire, New Evidence Regarding Firing Ratios, confirmed that the phenomena of the Civil War was not isolated. According to Marshall's observations in the European theater of World War II, nearly 85% of military infantry riflemen in the European theater were not actively firing their weapons, or they were not actively firing their weapons at exposed enemies, even to save their own lives. Marshall's findings, like Grossman's, are controversial among many historians and military commanders. The biggest critique is that their process and their findings were not acquired by an appropriate scientific method. However, the method applied by Marshall could not be any more concrete, in my opinion. Marshall would observe frontline and forward combat at the risk of his own life, and as soon as an active firing soldier was relieved of his duty, he would intensely question them on the front lines and record his findings. He would question them concerning their fire, concerning their targeting, concerning their intent, and oftentimes, as I've already said, he would find that they were not actively or willfully intending to shoot at or kill an enemy. His goal with these observations was to learn the cause of non-fires and finally to correct the problem for the military. He was a military man himself, and as he quotes in his book, "War is the business of killing." Marshall was not out to critique or injure the military or to defame it, which is probably one reason why his work is not very well known among the populace. His goal was to help the military achieve what he has already said is the goal of war, killing. This goal is already very problematic for those of us who would be just warriors. Killing is always a last resort in war, and never a first recourse, and often not finally the intent. Finally, Marshall concludes in his analysis of all of his works by saying, and this is astounding, something we should note, "The average and healthy individual has such an inner and usually unrealized resistance to killing a fellow man that he will not, of his own volition, take life if it is possible to turn away from that responsibility. At the vital point, the soldier becomes a conscientious objector." Grossman then restates, "This all indicates that there is a force in play, a previously undiscovered psychological force, a force stronger than drill, stronger than peer pressure, even stronger than self-preservation. What Grossman calls an undiscovered psychological force, we theologians and Christians must call the soul." Are there any questions about that section? Michael?
Was there anything in the research that indicated a correlation between combat with people of a different race with a higher rate of fire or a lower rate of non-fire? Did you see anything? I don't remember in the book myself if that was covered.
People of a different race or of a different nation?
Different race, because I'm thinking with Europe, with the conflict in Europe, you still have people that look like you, right? But then when we have war with nations that I'm just thinking of the propaganda from World War II, right? There's a dehumanization of the enemy there.
Yes.
And I would imagine that would help get past some of those obstacles for these men to fire. But does he address that at all in the book?
He does address it in the book. It's in the next section.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that's fine. I knew that this was going to happen with some of the questions, but this will come up in the next section.
Related to that, and I don't know if it's in the book, but maybe your thoughts are valuable enough, whether this has any relationship to a war that is actually justly declared. Or more so than that those fighting have a direct responsibility to defend their own homeland, rather than just doing the bidding of their Lord or whatever the case might be. So if those statistics might change if we were actually fighting against an invasion rather than, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is that the statistics from the Civil War, when it comes out down to it, and there is a lot of other work in here that I didn't include in this just for the sake of time, but Grossman points out the work of a man named Gwyn Dwyer, I can't remember, Dyer, and Dyer's work and observations are similar to the work of Marshall in World War II, and that the rate of fire, the ratio of the rate of fire actually between the Civil War, World War I, and World War II were quite consistent across domestic and foreign
Were they
conflicts.
southern or northern muskets that they tested?
It was all of them, right?
They didn't
Both
give any
sides.
distinction or anything?
No, it wasn't the collector, right? This guy, this is the beautiful thing about this collector's encyclopedia. All he is out to do is make money, right? Which makes him much more precise than any military historian. He is chronicling every musket in order to sell it, right? In his observations. What's that?
Was it that they loaded on top of each other?
Yeah, no,
So the 23, how in the world could you tell 23 times unless he basically loaded, didn't fire, loaded again?
Yeah.
Sort of habitually.
So the historical account of the Civil War is that when you have this mass of men firing these gigantic muskets with all the black powder and all this sort of thing, there's immense peer pressure that's involved in it. So you want to be involved in the fighting. So actually what was observed in certain historical accounts is that men would load their weapons and then not pull a trigger, but act like it. And then they were so involved in the drilling that they would reload it again. Right? They actually reloaded, but then they never pulled the trigger. And they would continue to do this right up to a
And
certain
these
time.
muskets, obviously, since they found these extra loadings, they weren't just guys who got shot before they had a chance to.
That's one of the amazing conclusions. He said, if this drilling made it possible for men to kill, then the percentage of muskets on the ground should not have been 90% with the load. He says maybe an understandable percentage is 20 or 30%, right? And you consider in the charging Civil War, there's going to be guys that have loaded muskets that are charging and they get mowed down and all sorts of stuff. But he said 90% of 24,500 muskets, 90% with a single load is very absurd statistically. And he says the Civil War soldiers, regardless of historical your historical outlook, were some of the most well-equipped and well-trained American soldiers that have been produced in this country. He says they should not have had 90% of the muskets unfired. He said they're acceptable. Other percentages would have been acceptable, but not 90%, and definitely not what it would be 50 or 45% with two loads in them.
Now, this goes with, discharging a weapon at a reasonable distance. Does he go into this phenomenon, prior to firearms? Because you can't really, fake,
Yes.
shooting an arrow or, using a sword or something like that. I mean,
He does not give historical account. I mean, it's really hard to fake it at a distance, if that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
His work is primarily with American soldiers, and his point finally isn't to say that the Civil War soldiers were bad, but he's simply observing historically that there is this aversion to killing that soldiers had that couldn't be manipulated by even the extent of the drilling. Bert had a question on that.
Yeah, I don't doubt that there's something to this, but did he go into any other possible explanations as to, I mean, the Civil War soldier will, if he loads his gun twice and realizes that he won't pull the trigger because two going off?
Well, no, actually,
He'll just load and load and load.
no, the way the black, if anybody's a black powder hunter, the way a black powder rifle works is, number one, it's impossible to jam it.
Yeah.
It's impossible. You can't jam it. The only way it can jam is if the powder's wet, or if the percussion cap is wet or something like that. But in that day and age, the advancements had moved away from the flintlock to these percussion caps,
Right.
which were a watertight ignition system,
Right.
and the loads of powder were wrapped in oiled paper, which was a specific military design to keep them dry and to keep them from misfiring in the tube. Now, if you load two loads into a black powder, I don't know if any of you, I've done this accidentally before. What happens is, unlike if your high-powered brass cartridge rifle is jammed or something like that, it'll blow the barrel up, right? But what you're talking about in a black powder rifle is an extremely heavy barrel with a 50 caliber or a 60 caliber bullet, which is an extremely heavy piece of lead, with a charge of powder that will be able to achieve 100 yards of a shot at some sort of reasonable trajectory, but after that, it's really bad. And so when you load 2 loads in, what happens is the first load that ignites just pushes the other load out, right?
Yeah.
And so what Grossman concludes is that even if the grog and the fog of war was such that you loaded your weapon and then it misfired or whatever, and you loaded another charge in or whatever, you replace the percussion cap, or even if it was wet, in a reasonable amount of time, because of the drilling, they could extract that, cram another load in, or if they didn't fire the first load and loaded another one, the first load would just push out the front. Right? And even if there were multiple loads, like 4 to 6 loads, it would still push all of the lead and powder out of the front of the gun. It just wouldn't, it would go 10 feet, right, if you've ever experienced those.
This thing, the grog and fog of war.
Right.
There's any number of reasons why, this phenomenon exists, I don't doubt that part of it is what you're talking about, what Dave Grossman's talking about there too. I don't know, it's.
Well, the Civil War, I'm not going to be an apologist for the Civil War data.
No.
Right? Grossman's final intent isn't to validate or invalidate the Civil War data.
No.
But what's even more arresting is the World War II data, which was much more scientifically gathered by this guy Marshall, and that his findings in an age of repeating rifles, machine guns, and more specialized training, right, produces a similar firing ratio. Right.
I think you answered my question. I was wondering if you put 2 or 3 balls in, if they would all go out and create a larger field of attack.
It's actually not more effective, right? If you're a Civil War historian at all, like the size and caliber of the lead was substantial. It was huge. And black powder, if you're a hunter, it is not as powerful. It's drams of powder for the amount of powder that you load into a black powder rifle with the size of the lead. It doesn't carry, right? Like we're used to in our day of warfare, we're used to high-powered, extremely compressed loads of black powder with light projectiles, like a 5.56 NATO round is a 55 grain bullet. A Civil War caliber bullet is like a 500 grain piece of lead. This is a significantly different piece of military weaponry, right? And if you load 3 of those gigantic pieces of lead with the extra weight of the powder, it's not going to create this gigantic cannon type spray. It's just going to peter out after 20 yards. Yeah.
Okay.
Colin.
I'm trying to see, does this imply that most people on that battlefield were stabbed to death?
Well, I don't go into the actual reasonings about the amount of bloodshed on Gettysburg, but contrary to the romanticized Hollywood versions that we often come into contact with, the amount of bloodshed that happened in Civil War battles wasn't because of the immediacy of the volley fire tactics. So you weren't seeing thousands of guys mowed down in the first 5 seconds of the war. Grossman actually points out historically that the Civil War battles lasted so excruciatingly long. Hours upon hours upon hours of, after the initial volley and fire, the lines would break down, and guys would be running for defilade into different places, but they would just continue shooting, and the artillery would keep going for hours, right? Over their heads, over their heads. They would be doing this historically. And he said after 8 hours of imprecise musket fire, bombardments of artillery, the body count just stacked up. He said it's not in the first place accredited to, the South and the North lining up at 25 yards and pointing at each other's faces with their gigantic muskets. That's not, he says finally, what caused the carnage. It was the length of the battles and the pursuit of the opposing forces over the course of long periods of time. Right? Those battles weren't 5 seconds. It's a significantly different historical account. John?
So just to clarify, to make sure I understand the statistics, we're talking about 10% of the soldiers did all the killing.
Yeah,
Besides cannon fire and gangrene and.
yeah, 10% of the riflemen, active riflemen, and Grossman even admits that might be a generous percentage. That there might have been 10% of the soldiers that were active in the act of firing, but maybe as few as 5% that were actually doing the pulling of the trigger, with another 5% finding loaded muskets to hand to the firing soldier, or taking the firing musket and loading it and then handing it back to him so he could keep firing while they supported him in his fire.
Well, it probably doesn't take into account, which would be hard, I would think almost impossible to do, the guys who actually were firing but were intentionally shooting into the ground.
Well, this gets into some of what I brought up about Marshall when he was doing his finding, is that there were guys that were shooting,
Yeah.
but they were shooting over the enemy or into the ground. They were firing without an intent to kill, right? They were firing particularly out of the range of an exposed target. Did you see that guy? He would say in his book, did you see that German? And they'd say, yeah. What do you do with that? Or how do you explain that? Finally, Marshall concludes, as I said, at the moment when the man is asked to pull the trigger on an exposed enemy and kill him, he becomes a conscientious objector. And then, as Grossman points out, this is because of a previously unknown psychological force.
Well, the sniper is entirely different because, there it's an exposed target.
We can talk about snipering, the difference between the snipering in World War II and later ages, but this brings us to a point where we should stop the questions for this section, and I should be able to run any questions. So any other questions, hold until I get through this next section. Section 3, the turn. The United States military solves the problem of non-fire. S.L.A. Marshall's work is, as I have said, mostly ignored by the secular world, by theologians, by researchers, by psychologists. It was not ignored by the military. The military was distressed by the reality of the observations of Marshall, that their soldiers were not trying to kill the enemy, was extremely, extremely problematic. So as the military does, they went to work to correct the problem. The same man, S.L.A. Marshall, was deployed to Korea with the same mission he had in the European theater, to forwardly observe soldiers and to question them concerning their fire and engagement of the enemy. His findings in Korea were now that only 45% of soldiers were not actively firing or not firing to kill the enemy. And in some infrequent cases in Korea, his observations revealed that as few as 5% of soldiers were withholding or intentionally missing their targets. This line of study continued in the military, and by the time of Vietnam, military historian and observer R.W. Glenn found that normally, throughout the military, 95% of American soldiers were firing with the direct intent to kill in Vietnam. The military had moved from a 15% firing ratio to a 95% firing ratio in 17 years. Grossman identifies what the military did in those years to achieve their goal. Psychological conditioning was applied en masse to a body of soldiers who in previous wars were shown to be unwilling or unable to kill the enemy. Grossman identifies a triad of psychological methods employed and institutionalized by the American military during this time. The first part of the triad is desensitization. Now, desensitization has always been around, and this answers Michael's previous question. Desensitization has always been around in war in one way or another. It is primarily, though, a coping mechanism used by soldiers who have killed in the act of warfare. The victim is reduced in some form or fashion to a non-human status, as a target, a mark, a gook, a slope, a dink, or a raghead, a subhuman creature that is easier to kill. However, in previous years, that is previous to Korea and Vietnam, the tactic of desensitization was employed by soldiers after the fact of killing, and not institutionalized and regularized and normalized before the act of killing. By the time of Vietnam, desensitization was highly institutionalized into the life of the American military. As one veteran observed, we normally would march in the morning for PT to the regular and rigorous chant of "Kill that gook, kill that gook." However, desensitization alone, according to Grossman, and this is true, is not sufficient to override the unwillingness to kill. So the military added another component and a second piece of what Grossman calls the triad: conditioning. Utilizing Pavlovian and the Pavlovian classical conditioning, and as well as Skinnerian operant conditioning, the military was able to tear down the individual psychological resistance and unwillingness to kill. Or as we theologians must say, the military began killing the conscience of men. Here Grossman admits that he has not been able to find a military person, a ranked officer, a military scientist, or any sociologist employed by the military who will directly communicate that it was the intent of the military government to use Pavlovian or Skinnerian methods to intentionally get their soldiers to kill. But as he observes it, and having gone through the process himself, he cannot do anything but reflect on the reality that the training the military is currently using is employing Pavlovian and Skinnerian tactics as a means applied to the military soldier to reach the military's ends of killing. From Grossman's own training, he observes that rather than being gathered in a heaping mass of humanity, and this is of course compared to Civil War and previous trainings, that rather than being amassed in a big wad of humanity and drilled in loading, reloading, advancing, and retreating so that you can load and reload mind-numbingly over hours and days and weeks and months, this newer training has become highly individualized in what is known as quick shoot programs. In these programs, individual soldiers are prone in grassy fields or in other situations with an instructor hovering close by, if not directly overhead. Periodically, over hours of time spent in the field, a man-shaped target will rise, and the soldier is instantly commanded to aim and shoot without thinking. Immediate feedback is then given by the instructor or the target. The target drops back in a posture of death. It is killed. The instructor immediately praises the soldier, congratulates him, and offers positive reinforcement for engaging. If the soldier misses, the instructor immediately ridicules the soldier. Peer pressure is applied in the training group. Retraining is applied. Failure to graduate is applied. Rewashing is applied, and derision is inevitable. Every aspect of killing is highly rehearsed, highly visualized, and conditioned into the individual man. And perhaps now we should say, woman. Often, according to Grossman, balloons or jugs are filled with red paint and stuffed into the man-shaped targets so that when the target is engaged, it bleeds or sprays and disperses a more powerful positive conditioning stimulus, which the soldier is encouraged to go after. In other scenarios and in other training tactics, actual pictures of men are used, and soldiers are trained to, and I quote, put 3 rounds inside the inside corner of the right eye. Chuck Kramer, chief instructor of the Israeli Defense Force Sniper Course. So this goes to the question about snipers. Chuck Kramer, chief instructor of the Israeli Defense Force sniper course, takes special care in his training. He says, I made the targets as real as possible. I changed the standard firing targets to full-sized, anatomically correct figures because no Syrian runs around with a big white square on his chest with numbers in it. I put clothes on these targets and polyurethane heads on the targets. I even cut up cabbages and poured ketchup in the cabbages and then stuck it all back together and put it on the target. I told my guys, when you look through the scope and pull the trigger, I want you to see a head blowing up. This conditioning is so powerful, so repetitive, that combat soldiers actually report after coming out of combat in the modern era, when describing actual events of killing, quote, I thought of the enemy as nothing more or less than a figure 2 target, or a man-shaped target. This quote illuminates the third aspect of the triad that Grossman describes, what is called denial defense mechanisms. Denial defense mechanisms are very simple. Grossman says, this careful rehearsal and realistic mimicry of the act of killing permits the soldiers to convince themselves, or himself or herself, that he has only engaged another target on the training course. End quote. This triad is extremely successful, as we see in the statistics of firing ratios over 17 years. Its enduring effects are tragic. Its safeguards are limited at best. While there are many other factors in play, the evidence of the enduring effects of this new modern training can be seen in the difference of the quality of the veterans returning from Vietnam as compared to those returning from World War II, World War I, or the Civil War. Questions? Yes, Kane.
I guess more of an observation. What pops into my mind is, number one, video games and the desensitization of that and very realistic depictions of violence.
Yep.
The other thing is, this is what we're training, I'm assuming using the same training methodology with Iraqi troops and Afghani troops, and I mean...
Yeah, so to address both of those,
Yeah.
Grossman's actually initial work, his first work in observing this is the psychological cost of learning to kill in war and society. Right, he has he includes his dissertation work from Arkansas State University, at which he observed directly the implications of violent first-person shooter games on young Southern teenagers and the viewpoint of humanity based on the desensitization that comes through those video games. And then to answer your second point, yes, one of the military's biggest exports is our training. Andrew.
Oh, sorry, let's see if you're looking at me. When I was in college, I had a friend who he used to be a skinhead, but not like it was like a traditional skinhead, not the kind of racist kind. Apparently those are like the original skinheads.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, basically they're just like, they're boys from bad upbringings, and they're violent and stuff like that. They're not necessarily racist, but then a lot of them ended up becoming, sort of recruited by the National Socialist movements. But he told me that when when they would get together, there would be National Socialists who would come and try to convert them or recruit them. He said that they'd also have that these guys are high recruits for the military as well, like people who are kind of used to sort of not just violence. So is that something that you have? So basically what I'm asking is that would they try to seek out people who've already been sort of desensitized before they train them?
I would, based on Grossman's book, I would say the military doesn't care. Based on Grossman's analysis of what's happening, one way or another, the military is going to get you to kill, whether you already want to or not.
You don't have to be predisposed because the training is so effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think effective is a word that is used quite regularly. Mike?
2 points. To the first one, there is a transition in the last, 15, 20 years, where there was a time, of course, back in the 40s and everything, go to prison or go to war, right? So there's this, we'll take the guys that are on Skid Row and that sort of thing, no problem with that. That has changed now, where if you have any kind of rap sheet, the military doesn't want you. Where it's actually harder to get into the military now in that regard. And so when you're going through the recruiting process, they dig up all that stuff because they don't want somebody they can't control. And so that's the other aspect of it, is they don't, yes, they want somebody who's willing to kill, but they want to control the killing. Not, and so
And that is one of the safeguards that Grossman brings up, and that's
Right.
fair, is that in the military training, one of the highly emphasized aspects of the killing is that it is at the command
right.
of an officer, right? It's never at the command of the individual. But this isn't a discussion for this paper, but that alone, that safeguard alone, which seems to be the only safeguard that's in place, doesn't account for the fact that when this man or person, this woman even, when they return into a society, there's nobody over them anymore.
Right.
Who are they taking their orders from? Like, this is like these silly doomsday movies, but this really becomes an important question. Who is giving the orders now? Right? The scary version?
Right.
They are, right?
And then my actual question, and I just want to address that real quick. My actual question is that with regards to this conditioning and this dehumanizing, and now it's a target, it's no longer, is it possible, I'm thinking from the side of I consider the chaplaincy, I have a lot of friends that are in the military, from the side of pastoral care, looking at this and saying this could actually help so that there's a separation between the necessary violence and not the necessary hatred, the breaking of the fifth commandment that is necessary to pull the trigger, and the ability to say, I killed, I didn't murder, right? That I killed, I upheld the sword, but I didn't hate him in my heart. Is it possible that it could be used that way rather than just dehumanizing and hating? It's from my experience in the military, I'm leaning towards no, because there's so much vitriolic anger towards the enemy that's inherent in that training. But I wanted your take on that.
I should have marked this with a quote, but there's a former military guy that gives an account of he's now a South Texas like Border Patrol trainer or something like that, and he actually institutes what he calls gosh, I can't remember now, but it's like enculturated hatred or something like that. He actually is training his Border Patrollers to hate Mexicans. Right?
Yeah,
Right,
that's
and this
obviously
is part of
the worst case scenario.
Yeah, right.
But I'm thinking with the turning it into a target, so you're no longer firing at a human being that you
Right.
hate. Now you're just hitting a target and getting rewarded for it.
Yep.
Is it possible that could be used to help with the pastoral care of this?
That we actually have that information
It's already there,
in
right?
hand.
Yeah, and we can help explain it that you were told to kill this man to prevent him from harming us. So you in that sense you were not murdering, you were killing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I would have to think about that a little bit more,
Okay.
and the pastoral implications of
Yeah.
changing a human to a non-human in order to kill. I mean, right off the bat, that strikes me as very long to accomplish the goal of killing, which already is maybe not an inherent goal of warfare, especially just warfare. Travis.
Yeah, it seems like there's a two-sided objectification that you're talking about. The military objectifies the soldier. He no longer is a conscientious objector, but simply a bundle of psychological and impulses that we can, like a dog, train.
Yep.
And condition.
Yep.
And there's a secondary objectification going on with the soldiers towards their enemies,
Yep.
right? That they become non-humans, right? We've talked about this in the past, and you have a really nice Heidegger quote, lengthy Heidegger quote on this.
Yeah.
So,
It's really interesting that this shift or this turn in military training and seeing individual soldiers, what I think, if I observe correctly from history, is that the American military in the days of the Civil War and World War II actually treated their soldiers like personnel, right? Persons who were there to be trained, right? So they had some aspect of personhood. But in the 50s, Heidegger observes that there's a transition in the mind of humanity in the way that we're attuned to the world that comes with the modern technological age, and that we no longer see things as they are, but we see things in relation to our desire for them, which is this sort of enduring essence of technology. Grossman picks up on this when he talks about these training techniques for the modern military have actually become more important than new technology. Of course, there he's talking about like new guns, new tanks, he's saying that this training method is a more important piece of warfare than having great technology. Because as he observes, the Civil War veteran and the Vietnam veteran were able to achieve, for their quality of technology, very high kill ratios when you think about it, for the amount of people that were firing and the amount of bodies that stacked up with the artillery and all that sort of thing. But when you increase an increasingly willing and able man or woman to pull the trigger at a target, you start seeing kill ratios like he gives evidence of, that in one instance in the Falkland Islands, when the British military engaged Argentinian ragtag militia or whatever, the British military achieved like a 1 to 193 kill ratio based on modern military tactics. That is, one British soldier killed 193 Argentinians for every, that's insane that the training and the technology can produce this. But what your point out is really accurate, is that the military is actually seeing soldiers and people no longer as persons, but as something there to be switched about.
which, really, it shows that there's such a contradiction, because how can you hold non-persons, these people who are conditioned, morally responsible?
There becomes at this point, it's probably becoming clear about the host of theological implications and pastoral care implications that fall out of this, right? James.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of that awesome scene in, was it True Blood, Rambo? Or First Blood?
First Blood.
First Blood, where he's bawling and everything. And anyway, so it seems that we've had, 6-7 decades of dehumanizing both the enemy and the actual soldier. And we all know about post-traumatic stress syndrome and the difficulty of re-assimilating military people. And we all have, friends or acquaintances who went to war, have come back, and there's something a little bit off. Have they addressed, are they going back the way they came in? Like, are they addressing what they did to the soldier and the way they look at other human beings in their assimilation? By saying, hey, we actually taught you to look at a human being as a non-human, or are they just giving them like puppies to cuddle, and
this is
something that will solve?
I didn't have a chance to interact with this in the book, but this is a big section of Grossman's book, is that in Vietnam, the American populace was able to experience firsthand the implications of psychological training on its soldiers. And that's why I said the quality of the veteran from Vietnam as compared to World War II is significantly different. Starting in Vietnam, he points out, you have a tremendous use of self-medication that's observed by soldiers both in the conflict and after the conflict that wasn't experienced, and mostly with psychotropic drugs.
Well, is this the military, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but is this the military purposefully not looking at a real solution because they have to admit that their very effective training is actually damaging to real human beings?
I don't think that they're actually, I don't think that they have a qualm about admitting that they are specifically training men to kill, and that this is an end, right? And when you think about it, nobody in my congregation would probably argue that that's problematic, right? But we're not asking these sorts of pastoral care questions when it comes down to it, which is ultimately my concern, right? So I started this whole paper by saying I had a young man come to me asking about service in the military. And I was like, yeah, do it, right? But this leads us into the final portion of the paper. Any other questions, though, save till after this. Save till after this. By now, it's readily apparent that this work creates a host of both theological and pastoral care concerns. If we're going to admit it very clearly, the psyche is the soul. This is also what is also readily apparent to me is that many of you sitting out here consider this to be the primary reason why you don't send your people to psychologists. You are concerned about the soul of your people, and you are concerned about what they are hearing and from whom they are hearing it, because you know that psychologists are after an adjustment upon the soul. Now, I will be the first to admit that I think the Freudian specter of psychology that has loomed large over the church and theologians for some time is dead. As I have been touching upon throughout this work, the military has now taken direct aim at the soul and the conscience of humanity in an indiscriminate way in order to remake and readjust what is naturally endowed by the Creator to meet the military's own ends. The military is systematically killing major aspects of the human conscience and soul and making alive a human consciousness in its own image to meet its own ends, increasingly willing and able to kill. Now, what I am not arguing with this analysis and recommendation in any way is that for the first time in history, we are coming to the conclusion that war in and of itself and the act of killing in and of itself create moral injury or inflict injury upon the soul and conscience of humanity. War injures the soul. War burdens the conscience. The scars run deep. And if you have, as was brought up, ever experienced this with a parishioner of yours, it is a repeated and haunting scar. This is perhaps why it is so pressing upon us as theologians and pastors to research more diligently and study more importantly the actual practice of just war in our current time. One of the aims of just war is to significantly reduce, if not completely eliminate, the injury to the conscience and soul of wartime. As we have heard, and as I will reassert, killing and war do not necessarily go hand in hand. That is, of course, an arguable point, but one based on just war that I think is a good assertion. Neither am I suggesting or recommending in any way that Christians should not engage or cannot engage in military practices or in combat. However, it is no longer fitting to indiscriminately give our okay to our young men to go into the military. As we are well aware of as Lutherans, there are some men whose consciences can bear the burden of certain vocations, and there are some men whose consciences cannot. I have no idea what it looks like to pastorally and intentionally look at the conscience and soul of a man in my congregation and assign to him the ability to take up the vocation of soldiering and potentially killing. I don't know what that looks like for us. But given the fact that the United States military is currently using these psychological training methods to systematically undo what God has endowed, cannot be overlooked or treated lightly. What I'm finally suggesting is more work for us. What I am suggesting is that your life just got much harder as a pastor. What I am suggesting is that we will be hated more and more as we actually suggest to people in our own parishes that entering into the military can do damage, and irreparable damage to the soul, that God might not want to happen. Teaching our people that the military has the direct intentions of killing the soul is arresting enough. Patriotism runs deep and is often problematic for a clear and concise confession of Christ. A suggestion, even the suggestion that the military is using such tactics incriminates the military in a serious way of committing crimes against the creation of God. It will make us no friends, not even among the clergy. But this should not be expected, as we cannot even get our heads wrapped around the reality that women have no place in combat, let alone the fact that certain men have no place in combat either. But I will make no equivocation. This book makes clear the fact that this is the current situation we are in. This is where we are. This is what we must address. We are theologians and preachers. We must be discerning, and we must teach discernment. This work will be done against an indiscriminate system in government as it is currently operating. We must work against so much that we must do this more often and have these sorts of honest discussions and research deeply. Because finally our task as theologians, and particularly our contribution to this nation and state, will be to do what Lutherans have always done best, calling the thing what it is. And what it currently is quite evil. Thank you.